While President Trump speaks confidently about bringing peace closer, the battlefield tells a different story. Headlines increasingly discuss negotiations, diplomatic contacts, and possible breakthroughs. Yet almost simultaneously, Russian forces continue offensive operations, long-range missile strikes, drone campaigns, and steady pressure along key sectors of the front. Ukraine, meanwhile, remains locked in a difficult defensive struggle, attempting to preserve military resilience while sustaining international support. At first glance, these developments appear contradictory. If peace is genuinely approaching, why does the fighting seem to be intensifying? The answer may lie in a strategic reality that has shaped wars for centuries. Diplomacy rarely unfolds independently from military events. Instead, negotiations often reflect whichever side believes it can still improve its position. Every village held, every supply route secured, and every successful strike can influence future bargaining power. From this perspective, continued military pressure may not undermine diplomacy. It may strengthen a negotiating strategy designed to secure better terms before serious talks begin. Most people see diplomacy and war as opposites, but modern geopolitics often reveals the opposite pattern. Military operations and diplomatic initiatives frequently advance together, each influencing the other's timing, confidence, and objectives. That raises a deeper question. Is Russia moving toward peace, or simply seeking maximum leverage before meaningful negotiations begin? Understanding this relationship requires looking beyond daily headlines and examining incentives rather than declarations. Governments rarely negotiate in isolation from battlefield realities. Public optimism can coexist with military escalation because leverage shapes every serious diplomatic decision. Section 1. Setting the stage. While President Trump has repeatedly argued that the war should end through negotiations, events on the ground continue moving in another direction. Russian forces have maintained pressure across multiple sectors, combining artillery, drones, missiles, and localized assaults designed to wear down Ukrainian defenses. Rather than signaling an imminent pause, these operations suggest that Moscow still sees military opportunities worth pursuing. Ukraine faces a difficult balancing act. Its commanders must preserve manpower, protect critical infrastructure, and stabilize vulnerable front lines while sustaining public confidence and international support. Every defensive decision carries strategic consequences because conserving resources today may determine future resilience. Across Europe, governments continue debating military assistance, industrial production, sanctions, and long-term security planning. NATO officials remain focused on deterrence, alliance readiness, and the possibility that prolonged conflict could reshape European security for years. At the same time, diplomatic contacts continue through various channels, even when public expectations fluctuate with each new headline. None of these discussions guarantees an agreement, but they demonstrate that political communication rarely stops, even during intense fighting. This creates an apparent paradox. Public messaging increasingly emphasizes the possibility of negotiations, yet military competition remains active. The reason is that both Russia and Ukraine still have incentives to improve their respective positions before accepting difficult compromises. Battlefield developments influence perceptions of strength, endurance, and credibility, all of which affect future bargaining power. Diplomatic intentions, therefore, cannot be separated from strategic leverage. That distinction is often overlooked. Peace proposals are not evaluated only by their language or political appeal. They are judged against realities on the battlefield, where territory, logistics, force readiness, and external support shape every calculation. As long as decision-makers believe additional military pressure could improve their position, meaningful ceasefire proposals remain difficult to achieve. But these latest offensives are not isolated events. They fit into a broader pattern that has defined this conflict for years, where military action and diplomacy evolve together rather than independently. To understand why today's developments follow that pattern, it is necessary to examine how this stage of the war gradually emerged from earlier strategic decisions and evolving realities. Section 2. Historical background. When Russian forces launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, many observers expected a rapid military victory. Moscow's initial objectives appeared focused on quickly pressuring Kiev into political concessions while securing strategic territory. Instead, determined Ukrainian resistance, supported by extensive Western military, financial, and intelligence assistance, disrupted those assumptions. The failed drive toward Kyiv forced Russia to reassess its campaign. Military priorities shifted toward eastern and southern fronts, where geography, logistics, and concentrated firepower offered different opportunities. Ukraine, meanwhile, adapted as well, integrating newly supplied equipment, refining operational planning, and pursuing counteroffensives that demonstrated Russia could be pushed back. Yet neither side achieved the decisive breakthrough many had predicted. As the conflict continued, both militaries increasingly embraced attritional warfare, seeking gradual advantages through sustained pressure rather than dramatic maneuvers. Drones became indispensable for reconnaissance, targeting, and increasingly long-range strikes, while artillery, fortified positions, and industrial production regained central importance. Victory was no longer measured by spectacular advances alone, but by endurance, replacement capacity, and the ability to sustain operations over time. Economic sanctions sought to constrain Russia's resources, while Ukraine's partners expanded defense production and coordinated additional assistance. At the same time, diplomatic initiatives periodically emerged, only to lose momentum as battlefield conditions evolved. Proposals that appeared plausible one month often became politically unacceptable after territorial changes, shifting military fortunes, or renewed offensives altered each side's expectations. The deeper lesson was that strategy evolved alongside the conflict itself. Russia adjusted its objectives, Ukraine refined its defense, and outside supporters recalibrated their commitments according to changing realities. Early assumptions about a short war gradually gave way to recognition that this had become a prolonged contest involving military endurance, economic resilience, technological adaptation, and political resolve. Importantly, both governments also adapted politically. Domestic expectations increasingly reflected the realities of a prolonged conflict rather than hopes for immediate resolution. Defense industries expanded production, commanders emphasized sustainability, and international partnerships became as important as battlefield tactics. Every campaign influenced diplomatic calculations, while every diplomatic signal affected military planning. Instead of following separate paths, politics and warfare became mutually reinforcing processes. That persistent interaction explains why today's negotiations cannot be understood without appreciating the history that shaped both sides. Section 3. The hidden strategic story. What appears to be another offensive may actually be shaping the future negotiating table. That possibility helps explain why Russia continues applying military pressure even as discussions about peace receive international attention. From Moscow's perspective, negotiations are not separate from military operations. They are influenced by them. If commanders believe additional territorial gains can improve future bargaining positions, slowing the campaign too early could reduce diplomatic leverage. Every kilometer captured, supply route secured, or defensive position improved has political value alongside military value. Maps eventually become negotiating documents, and battlefield realities often determine which compromises leaders consider acceptable. That is why military pressure and diplomatic messaging frequently advance together, even when they appear contradictory. Ukraine faces the opposite calculation. Holding territory strengthens its negotiating position, demonstrating resilience and preserving options for any future settlement. Losing ground, by contrast, risks weakening political influence while increasing pressure from partners and domestic audiences. Every defensive decision therefore carries consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. Military planners also think in terms of time. Attritional warfare aims to exhaust an opponent's resources, personnel, logistics, and confidence over months rather than days. Russia has invested heavily in expanding defense production while relying on drones, missiles, and sustained operational tempo to maintain pressure. Ukraine, supported by Western assistance, continues adapting its own capabilities. Intelligence assessments on both sides are therefore concerned not only with enemy capabilities, but also with endurance, production, recruitment, and political cohesion. Commanders measure ammunition stocks, replacement rates, infrastructure resilience, and alliance commitments because these factors influence future options as much as immediate tactical results. Diplomatic confidence grows when leaders believe those indicators favor their position. This dynamic also presents a challenge for Washington. Even if the United States encourages negotiations, neither side is likely to embrace significant compromises simply because outside actors prefer a settlement. Moscow will judge proposals against conditions along the front, while Kyiv will evaluate whether accepting terms preserves sovereignty, security, and long-term viability. Political timelines in foreign capitals rarely align with military timelines on the battlefield. For that reason, public statements about peace should be viewed alongside operational developments rather than instead of them. Every offensive, defensive stand, logistics effort, and aid package contributes to the broader balance of leverage. What appears to be another offensive may actually be shaping the future negotiating table. The deeper issue is not whether diplomacy matters, but when leaders conclude additional fighting no longer improves their position. Until that calculation changes for both sides simultaneously, negotiations are likely to remain constrained by military realities rather than political aspirations alone, despite continuing diplomatic engagement. Section 4. Why this changes everything. This is no longer only about Ukraine. It has become a test of how modern power is exercised. What began as a regional war now influences security planning across Europe and far beyond. Governments are reassessing defense priorities, industrial capacity, and the assumptions that shaped the post-Cold War era. The conflict has forced policymakers to reconsider how deterrence, resilience, and sustained military readiness should be measured. For European governments, the war has reinforced the importance of collective security. NATO members have expanded defense planning, accelerated procurement, and strengthened coordination across the alliance. Many states are investing in ammunition production, air defenses, logistics, and infrastructure that can support prolonged crises. These changes reflect recognition that future conflicts may demand endurance as much as technological superiority. For the United States, the conflict continues shaping debates about global commitments and strategic priorities. Decisions regarding military assistance, alliance leadership, and defense investment influence not only Ukraine, but Washington's credibility with partners elsewhere. Allies watch whether American commitments remain consistent, while competitors assess how the United States balances European security with challenges in other regions. China is observing these developments closely. Although the circumstances differ, policymakers can study how sanctions, defense industries, alliance coordination, economic resilience, and technological adaptation affect long conflicts. The lessons extend beyond Europe because every major power seeks to understand how modern warfare interacts with diplomacy, economics, and domestic politics. Energy markets have also adjusted to prolonged uncertainty. Governments and businesses increasingly emphasize supply diversification, infrastructure protection, and strategic reserves. Economic security has become more closely connected to national security, reinforcing the idea that geopolitical competition extends well beyond the battlefield. Military doctrine is evolving accordingly. Armed forces around the world are examining the effectiveness of drones, long-range precision strikes, electronic warfare, logistics, battlefield intelligence, and industrial mobilization. They are studying not only successful operations but also costly mistakes, recognizing that future conflicts may reward adaptation more than initial advantages. If negotiations eventually occur while military pressure continues, the political consequences could be significant. Any agreement reached under active battlefield competition will inevitably reflect relative leverage as much as diplomatic compromise. That reality affects perceptions of fairness, durability, and international credibility. Moreover, the conflict has challenged long-standing assumptions about escalation management. Throughout the war, governments have tried to support partners without triggering direct confrontation between nuclear powers. That balancing act has required constant diplomatic coordination, careful signaling, and incremental policy adjustments. It also demonstrates that modern deterrence involves communication as much as military capability. Credibility depends not only on weapons, but on consistent political decisions sustained over time. As other regions confront their own security challenges, these experiences will influence alliance planning, procurement strategies, crisis management, and expectations about collective responses to future aggression. Whether policymakers draw the correct lessons remains uncertain, but few doubt that military institutions and political leaders are studying this conflict with exceptional attention because its consequences will extend globally tomorrow. The broader message is unmistakable. This conflict has become a measure of alliance cohesion, industrial resilience, strategic patience, and political resolve. It is influencing how governments define deterrence, prepare for future crises, and evaluate long-term competition between major powers. The next question is whether these evolving dynamics make a negotiated peace more achievable, or whether continued efforts to improve leverage will delay meaningful compromise even further. Section 5. What happens next? The outcome may depend less on speeches and more on who controls the initiative over the coming months. No one can state with confidence how the conflict will end, but several plausible paths are emerging. Each depends on battlefield conditions, political decisions, economic endurance, and the willingness of outside actors to sustain their commitments. Rather than predicting a single outcome, it is more useful to examine the incentives shaping future choices. Scenario 1 begins with stabilization along the front. If neither side believes additional offensives can produce meaningful gains, diplomatic contacts could acquire greater momentum. A relatively stable military balance would not guarantee peace, but it could encourage practical discussions over ceasefires, humanitarian arrangements, prisoner exchanges, and broader negotiations. Scenario 2 assumes Russia seeks additional leverage before serious talks. Continued offensives, missile strikes, and pressure on Ukrainian logistics could aim to improve Moscow's bargaining position. Such an approach carries costs, yet leaders may judge those costs acceptable if they believe stronger battlefield positions will produce better diplomatic outcomes. Scenario 3 centers on renewed Western military assistance that strengthens Ukraine's defensive capacity and alters strategic calculations. Expanded defense production, improved air defenses, long-range capabilities, and sustained financial support could convince Moscow that continued escalation offers diminishing returns. That might reshape negotiating incentives without guaranteeing immediate compromise. Scenario 4 envisions a prolonged period of attrition punctuated by intermittent diplomacy. Fighting would continue at varying intensity while negotiations repeatedly open, stall, and resume. This pattern has characterized many extended conflicts, where political dialogue persists despite ongoing military operations. Every scenario carries risks. Domestic politics may narrow leaders' room for compromise. Sanctions could continue influencing economic resilience. European governments will face difficult choices regarding assistance, defense spending, and long-term security commitments. Miscalculation remains a constant danger, particularly if either side interprets temporary battlefield success as evidence that decisive victory remains achievable. International responses will also influence whichever path emerges. Neutral states may expand mediation efforts, while allies reassess commitments according to domestic priorities and economic pressures. Financial markets, defense industries, and energy planners will continue watching the conflict for signals of either stabilization or escalation. Every adjustment in external support can subtly change calculations inside Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, and European capitals alike, influencing strategic expectations on all sides. Ultimately, uncertainty is the defining feature of this war. Strategic patience, industrial capacity, alliance cohesion, and political endurance will matter as much as individual battles. The outcome will depend not only on military capability, but also on whether decision-makers conclude that further fighting no longer improves their position. Until then, diplomacy and combat are likely to remain intertwined, shaping each other with every passing month. Which brings us back to the question that opened this documentary. Section 6. Conclusion. We began with a simple question: if peace is approaching, why does the battlefield appear more active than ever? Throughout this documentary, one theme has emerged repeatedly. Diplomatic optimism and military escalation are not always opposing forces. In many conflicts, they develop together because each side believes additional leverage today may produce better terms tomorrow. President Trump's calls for negotiations exist alongside Russia's continued efforts to shape conditions on the ground. Rather than treating those developments as mutually exclusive, it may be more accurate to view them as different expressions of the same strategic competition. Military operations influence diplomacy, while diplomatic signals influence military planning. History suggests that wars rarely end simply because leaders declare they should. Durable agreements usually emerge when military realities, political objectives, economic pressures, and international incentives begin pointing in the same direction. Until those factors align, negotiations often remain constrained by calculations of power rather than aspirations for peace. That does not mean diplomacy is unimportant. On the contrary, diplomatic engagement becomes most meaningful when it reflects changing strategic realities instead of attempting to ignore them. The challenge for every participant is determining when further fighting no longer improves its position enough to justify the cost. For now, uncertainty remains the defining characteristic of this conflict. Battlefield leverage, strategic patience, alliance cohesion, and political endurance continue shaping every major decision. Whether current developments ultimately shorten the war or prolong it depends on choices that have not yet been made. The next chapter of this conflict may not begin at the negotiating table. It may begin on the battlefield that determines who eventually sits there with the stronger hand. That unanswered question extends beyond Ukraine, influencing Europe, global security, and future conflicts alike. Watching speeches alone will never reveal the outcome. Watching incentives probably will instead.